All right, a festive Saturday morning to everyone tuning in here in our Zoom room and in our Facebook Live. We are back once again to the celebration of the Fiesta of Imagination organized by the Philippine Futures Thinking Society, which marks the organization's first year founding anniversary. Just a quick montage on our grand opening last June 2. We formally opened the month-long event starting off with a discussion on Hiraya foresight and the indigenization of futures thinking. We had wonderful provocations with Miss Sofia Bazile, Professor Mauricio Hernandez, and of course through the presentation of our very own Dr. Lizan E. Perante Calina and the moderation of Dr. Reginald G. Ugadan. This time, in collaboration with the Philippine Society for Public Administration, we welcome you to the special webinar titled Anticipatory Governance Towards a Futures Ready Philippine Public Service. To give the opening message, it is my pleasure to call on our President, Dr. Lizan E. Perante Calina.
Thank you very much, Sinch. Good morning, magandang umaga, good day to everyone who are in the international arena. Welcome again to the virtual floors of Philippine Futures Thinking Society and to the second day of our Fiesta of Imagination. Happy Futures Day and happy Fiesta to everyone. So very briefly, I would like to make some provocations as well, some questions as we begin our conversation on anticipatory governance. Why is it important for all of us to have this long-term mindset compared to the short-termism mindset and culture that we have right now? But taking the lens of public administration and governance, I would like to ask a few questions like why public sector reform matters and how do we want our public sector reform to be more efficient, effective, responsive, and not only that, because of the 21st century, we are challenged by the condition, we are challenged by the context, especially the global health pandemic. So how are we going to make our public sector futures ready? Because it's in the plural form, meaning to say we have so many features to face, not only about technological convergence, but of course, will include our capacity to manage the daily affairs of the public sector. And how will public sector respond in a resilient and efficient manner, considering of the many disruptions, discontinuities, and disturbances that we are facing right now? So public sector reform initiatives always matter. And although this will form as a fundamental shakeup, but somehow it will help us become futures ready and also not really future proof, but we cannot because we cannot future proof our public sector reform, but somehow we are ready to face the next challenges, the next phase of our life. No? Like for example, in the next 5, 10, or 15 years, we are ready to that. And of course, the continuing capacity building and the continuing education and knowledge co-creation in the public sector. And somehow, of course, the reforms that we want in the public sector, like for example, the shift from traditional manner of conducting daily affairs or business, from that voluminous paper documents and paperworks that are required from us by our government agencies to an online or seamless connectivity around the organization. So with that, let's enjoy, and I'd like you also to participate actively in the discussion via chat box. You can encode your insights and perspectives on how are we going to improve our government sector, especially that we are in the 21st century and be ready to the next decade. So welcome and Hiraya Manawari po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lizan. Wow, thank you for stimulating today's discussion. Taking off from that note, the Philippine Public Service really do need to cope with the demands of the changing workplace. But what lens should we look at in order to achieve this? So, ladies and gentlemen, to begin today's provocation, allow me to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Maria Oliva Z. Domingo is currently the president of Kalayaan College. She continues to teach graduate courses at the UPNCPAG until today. She handles courses in human resource management and development, leadership, human behavior in organizations, organization studies, resource generation, and voluntary sector management. She is a much sought after resource person on strategic planning, leadership, change management, and organization related topics by national government agencies, local government units, and non government organizations. She has a long list of local and international publications and is the recipient of international publication awards. Please welcome our senior fellow, Dr. Maria Oliva Domingo.
Thank you very much, Celine. And good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, wherever you may be, who are participating in this webinar today. The imperative to shift our mode of interaction into the digital platform as a consequence of the pandemic brings us this opportunity to bridge our distance and time zones through the wonders of technology. And the whole world has been jolted to the reality that a single event such as this health crisis we're experiencing today, can bring about such devastating effects in all aspects of our lives. It is showing us that powerful or weak nations, the rich or the poor, are equally vulnerable when we are unprepared for possible events in the future. One thing we know for sure is that the future is plural and definitely unpredictable. We therefore invite you today to join us in the conversation on anticipatory governance towards a futures-ready Philippine public service. Celine?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lily Domingo, for that opening statement on the provocation that we will discuss today. Following the program structure, I would now like to open the polylog. Our panelists for today are experts in the field of futures thinking and governance. We have first Dr. Jerome Glenn, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Millennium Project. He was the Washington, D.C. representative for the United Nations University as executive director of the American Council for the UNU from 1988 to 2007. He has over 40 years of futures research experience working for governments, international organizations, and private industry in science and technology policy, environmental security, economics, education, defense, space, futures research methodology, international telecommunications, and decision support systems with the Committee for the Future, Hudson Institute, Future Options Room, and the Millennium Project. He has addressed or keynoted conferences for over 300 government departments, universities, NGOs, UN organizations, and or corporations around the world on a variety of future-oriented topics. Next, we have our very own Professor Sherman Cruz, who is the founder, executive director, and chief futurist of the Center for Engaged Foresight, the premier strategic foresight, futures thinking, futures literacy, and design innovation hub in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific region. He currently serves as the vice president of the Philippine Futures Thinking Society, and he is also the chair of the Association of Professional Futurists. And finally, we are also graced by Dr. Alex B. Brillantes Jr., who is a professor at the National College of Public Administration and Governance of the University of the Philippines, where he also served as its dean for 2 terms from 2002 to 2008. Dr. Brillantes is the former president of the Asian Association for Public Administration and of the Philippine Society for Public Administration. He earlier served as chairman of the Philippine Social Science Council and board member of the Galing Pook Foundation and the Local Government Development Foundation. He was also a trustee of the Local Government Academy. Dr. Alex Brillantes is also our senior fellow at the Philippine Futures Thinking Society. Our three panelists may now head on to the polylog. I am now giving back the virtual floor to Dr. Domingo to facilitate.
Okay, maybe we'll start with the 3-minute each introductory statements of the three members of our panel. We start with Dr. Jerome Glenn.
Thank you. I see governance on the future or futuristic governance in two ways. One is how you organize government or the governance system of corporations or universities to anticipate future situations and act intelligent present tense. In that one way, I would recommend what I put in the chat of a report called Anticipatory Governance by Leon Firth. So hopefully anybody can go into the chat and get the reference for that. It has very simple ideas like the president's office or the prime minister's office could have a list of futurists across the Philippines. And if he has a meeting in 2 days on the future of solar energy, somebody could send out a note to all these people on their email, go to a real-time Delphi or some software that keeps track of judgments and ratings, and say, okay, what should I know about the meeting in 2 days about the future of solar energy? And then all that can be put together and put on the president's desk immediately and within a day or two, so that you're pulling together the collective intelligence of the Philippines on any particular issue. That's a very simple way. Another is that as people are evaluated in their jobs, they could also be evaluated in terms of their anticipatory or their future judgments. Right now, we evaluate people on all kinds of things, but not on their future judgments. If they did, then they would have to take future judgments seriously, which they do not right now. Many government officials are afraid to make a statement about the future because if it doesn't turn out to be useful, then they're looked at as a fool. So as a result, people are afraid to make any comments about the future. So many of these ideas are covered in that report. I won't go into it. I strongly, very strongly recommend you download the report and read it. This is for the United States, but these lessons are applicable to other governments as well. It focuses mostly on the White House, but it's also governance in general. So that's one approach. The second approach on anticipatory governance is to govern something that's not there yet. You're looking at how to manage something that's not there, which means people will tell you you're premature. You're doing this ahead of time. We're not ready for that. But that is extremely important. And the application I would talk about right now very quickly is the transition from artificial narrow intelligence, which we do have today, to artificial general intelligence, which we don't have right now. The reason this is important is that how the next step, which is artificial superintelligence, the way that that evolves will be beyond our control. The only control we have is the transition from narrow, which we have today, to general intelligence. That we can manage a governance system. How do we create a governance system before it is there? Why is this important? Because if it happens and we're not ready for it, it will be beyond our control. So here's another idea of anticipatory governance, is to govern something that's not there yet, because it'll take years to figure out how to do this right. Years. So we have to start now. Let's see if I can get the next slide right here. Okay. An existential survival challenge for anticipatory governance. You've all heard Elon Musk and Hawkins and Gates saying, Artificial intelligence could be the last thing that ever happens to civilization. Oh my goodness gracious, it's a big problem. You've also heard science fiction say, oh, this is all these, robots are going to kill us and all. Okay, that is possible only if we don't get the initial conditions right for general intelligence. Narrow intelligence is what we have today. Narrow intelligence drives a car. It doesn't diagnose cancer. The artificial intelligence that diagnoses cancer does not drive a car. They're narrow. They're machine learning. They get smarter. All those things you hear about, all true, but it's within narrow focus. General is more like us in the sense that it can address novel problems, draw on the Internet of Things, draw on other databases around the world, can interview experts because they're going to sound like a human being, an expert interview. They can do all the stuff that we would do when we try to figure out how to solving a problem. The only difference is they can do it much faster than we can. If it takes 10 to 15 years to create the treaties and the governance system from today, and if artificial general intelligence could arrive as soon as 10 to 15 years, then we have to begin now. This is deadly serious. Now, someone will tell you that artificial general intelligence may take longer. True, absolutely true. But it might come in 10 to 15 years. Futurists don't tell you the truth of the future. We tell you what's possible. What are the things we have to consider in these possibilities? Is it possible to have artificial general intelligence in 10 to 15 years? Yes. The people who are writing code right now, they will tell you that it might be that soon. The people who are not writing code, they tend to say it's going to be longer. In any case, as your friendly neighborhood futurist, I'm here to tell you we have to take it seriously, that it could happen in 10 to 15 years. If it does, then we got to be ready. And we got to be ready by UN treaties, UN government systems, and all that sort of stuff, which means we have to figure out how to do it now. So one of the things the Millennium Project is doing, I'm happy to have your experts in the Philippines be involved in this, is to scan the environment of literature, all of the ideas about how to do this, so we know the right questions to ask. Then we give those questions into a real-time Delphi, and then use the responses to that to create different models and different scenarios for each of the models. So let's say that there are, let's say, 5 different approaches. For each of those 5 different approaches, we want to be able to say, here's how it could be a mixed success. Here's how that model could lose control. Because all good ideas can be implemented badly. And then how can it turn out in a good way? So that means we may end up with 15 different scenarios. And then we would see what unresolved questions are there, and then send out some questions, rewrite the scenarios, and make this available. This is one approach to anticipatory governance that I would recommend people consider. We're doing it on the AI, artificial intelligence issue. There's also issues of synthetic biology. There's all kinds of other issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn, for that opening statement. Let's now listen to Professor Sherman's opening statement.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hiraya Manawari to each and every one of us who are here this morning. And I would like to embark from what Jerry have said about how, artificial intelligence as a megatrend is shaping and influencing the way we govern. But I would like to put again, some sort of accentuate some basic principles or concepts in order for us to have a better grip and understanding of what anticipation is all about. And I would say that governing and governance is a series of collisions with the future. So each and every one of us, live in particular situations and circumstances. In fact, a Spanish philosopher have said, several decades or perhaps hundreds of years ago. Perhaps that was in the 18th century, early or mid 18th century. He said that I am myself and my circumstances. He accentuated the fact that we are all immersed in particular situation, particular belief systems, and particular assumptions. And these assumptions about the future is informed and driven by a lot of things, like, for example, our experiences, our socioeconomic conditions, our faith, the narratives, the metaphor, the story that we all tell ourselves. But then, of course, there are also megatrends, drivers of change, leaders and movements, and disruptions at the planetary level that informs and drives us to believe in something. Now, when I say that governing and governance is a series of collisions with the future, is that as we try to govern ourselves, we always find our way ourselves in a situation wherein we try to imagine new possibilities. Right? We have history. We talked about the problems and the conditions of change. The situations that we are that we all tell ourselves at this point, like, for example, poverty, corruption, development, progress, infrastructure, knowledge creation, so forth and so on. So when we try to transcend ourselves in the situation and belief systems that we all tell ourselves, that drives the way we perceive about the future, that is where, and then when we try to anticipate possibilities, that is where futuring begins. So when in the process of futuring, you try to anticipate possibilities, as Jerome has told us a while ago. But one basic principle in futures in foresight is that the future does not exist yet. It is not literally the now. The future is invisible, right? But there are snapshots about the future. And then we try to make sense of this snapshots of the future, or some other futurists might call it, the emerging stories about the future. So when you try to anticipate these things, in fact, you don't predict them, because futuring or foresight is not about prediction. But of course, in one way or another, it is related to forecasting, but it is not forecasting. Is that when you try to make sense of the future, you are actually anticipating possibilities. And anticipation is a capacity and capability that everyone have, right? It's just a matter of getting it. It's a matter of finding ways how to nurture this ability of a natural foresight, which is anticipation. Each and every one of us anticipate in one way or another. Like when you wake up in the morning, you anticipate what you're going to do today and plan something out. You try to anticipate what will happen tomorrow, next week, next month, a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. But then there are also different intentions on why people anticipate. And when you try to place anticipation in the context of foresight, in the context of anticipatory governance, that is where you try to some sort of embed and integrate anticipation in systems, right? Individually, we all anticipate, but organizationally, to a certain degree, perhaps we could. But then if you try to integrate and embed anticipation in a governance context, it also means it has to be, systematic, logical, rigorous, and some colleagues would say a rigid process of governing from the future. Now, when we imagine new possibilities, we have a choice whether or not to reject or accept these new imaginings and possibilities. Like, for example, how might you situate Philippine governance, you know, f- with narrow or super artificial intelligence as a lens? How might the future of governance look like? How might the future of public service delivery look like when it is highly efficient, ultra high tech, and artificially intelligent driven? So you can have a conversation about AI or the future of governing and governance in the context of AI, or AI as a lens to explore possibilities. Now, try imagining that now. How might the future of governance look like by the year 2030 and 2040? And try to situate that in transport management, national defense, civil service. So you could actually like frame, AI in the context of governing in the context of AI in those areas and themes. Now, when we accept or reject these new imaginings and possibilities, is that where the future or governing and governance collides with current circumstances. And that is why I say that governing and governance is a series of collisions with the future. And to enable us to empower and engage ourselves, to create and invent, the future that we want, cap- building capabilities and capacities. Futures literacies is very critical and crucial to the future of governing. And overall, just to like just some sort of weave all of these initial ideas that I have, is that governing and governance is really about transforming human lives, right? Trying to figure out how we could fulfill genuine human needs in the context of governing and governance. Governing and governance really is that when you put that in the context of the past, present, or future, it doesn't really matter, but it is really about life. So I would say overall is that governing and governance in the context of not survival. I don't want to say human survival, because futuring and foresight is beyond survival. It is all about transforming living and the way we experience life. So in a nutshell, life is a series of collisions with the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Sherman. That is very intriguing, no? When you talk about governing and governance as a series of collisions between our existing belief systems and our possibilities of the future, and providing us with that option, whether or not we accept such imaginings, or we reject them. And that makes governance indeed very challenging, and especially when framed against the context of um, improving, transforming, changing human lives. Now let's listen to our third guest here, Dr. Alex Brillantes, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Lily. If you could just share screen, thank you. I think we're okay now. Can you see my screen, Lily?
Yeah, just put it on full.
So my presentation, it's not a presentation. My opening statement really is based on my own experience in government. Full time, I've worked.
Put your presentation on presentation mode.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And like I said, my thoughts today are really prefaced on my own experience as having worked in government for close to 10 years full time, and of course an academic for 40 years. I guess without being presumptuous, somebody once told I was some kind of a academic practitioner and academic. So even before, I'm not being presumptuous, but even before I do so, Lisan told me to look at some of these webinars, and I did. And thank you, Jerome. I've met you before. I don't know if you remember me, but I watched this webinar, which was very, very powerful within the context of governance. And this will not take more than 4 minutes, I promise. Okay, so if you listen to what Jerome has said today, and I'm really pleased to be honored to be sharing the platform today with him, he talked about governance. It's coming up with governance systems that before the thing exists that you are governing, then you talk about it won't be around for 10, 20 years. Is this premature? Hey, Jerome tells us, hey, our job is to be premature. And his colleague in the panel was Jake, who talked also about the need to. And this, I really agree with this. the need to challenge core assumptions. I've always told our students, learn to question authority, learn to look at the question beyond the question. And I think that is really part of, I guess, anticipatory governance within the bureaucracy. And I must mention that is not really part of the discipline of us in the bureaucracy. We're talking about public sector reform and anticipatory governance. We're going against some kind of culture here. And the culture here is really the bureaucracy, stability, no change, no? But hey, if we're talking anticipatory governance, we're talking about learning to challenge the status quo, something that is really very, very important within the context of public sector reform. And the third speaker was, of course, Nicholas Larsen, who talked about the need to think anew, talking about the need to change our mindsets, our mental models, which was also informed by, and this was what Elizabeth mentioned about in the subsequent webinar after your webinar, Jerome, pertain to the need to address inequality. But for me, it's more than inequality; it's inequity, as I will discuss in a few in the remaining few minutes. Okay, I guess, and of course we are familiar. I've listened to you before, Jerome, on the 15 global challenges. And if you look at this, come on, what's going on? How can we? I mean, the future isn't exactly as bright, if you may. I have three. I will have three grandchildren soon, and I sometimes wonder, is this the kind of future that they need? No, and of course some of us are familiar with Noam. I've known, not that I've known him, I've listened to him when I studied at the in Hawaii. Oh, by the way, your other colleague, his name is Jacob, also graduated from the University of Hawaii, and I noted from his bio. But anyway, when we were in Hawaii, we were listening to Noam, and Noam is really one of those who really talk about this, but he cautioned against the existential threats to humanity. Point, what is governance, or will we still have governance by then? In one sense, Jero, it's within that context that we're saying, existential threats to humanity, and we're all anticipating this, or maybe it might have any of these three aspects: nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, and the pandemic. And I was just listening to Noam about maybe just a few months back. Okay, so he talked about the 10 existential threats, which I think are not so different from the Millennium Challenges that were pointed out by Jerome and his very brilliant team. Okay, so as I'm sure many of you, it's running out of everybody's ears, VUCA, VUCA, VUCA. But there's some validity to this. But the point is, if we're talking anticipatory governance, we talk about not really volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. Let's look at be more positive, as Sherman, I think, suggested earlier, from volatility to vision. I'll end with this: volatility to vision, uncertainty to understanding. That's why we're here today. Understanding, complexity to clarity, and ambiguity to agility. In that sense, VUCA can mean that way. And Lisan also advised me, hey, why don't you listen to what our Malaysian colleagues mentioned? And these are three brilliant Malaysian colleagues. And when I looked at this, I loved it because to a certain extent, it somehow reinforces our own paradigms. They talk about the need for systemic changes. They talk about government governance. They talk about societal transformation. Sherman, you mentioned that. But what I like most about this, new mental models for public sector, as I will suggest later on. Sometimes that is the biggest challenge. But when we're talking about public sector, we reform structures. I'll talk about that later. We'll have to reform mindsets. And that is within the Malaysian context, they talk about new mental models. So they talk about shifting again from citizen control to citizen control. To a certain extent, if one looks at this, I've heard so many, many lectures, etc. People always talk about the importance of citizens' engagement. And I think that is so true. And that is what we included in our paradigm of reform that I worked with my colleagues, Dr. Lisan and also Professor Maricel Fernandez, which we've done this for about, maybe more than 13, 14 years now. And it's within that context where we put on our own experiences in government. Okay, so this was the framework that we've used with, okay. Talking anticipatory governance, hey, talking public sector reform, we have to reform structures, which is up here, but hey, equally important, you reform mindsets, leadership, and citizen engagement. I'll just give me 2 more minutes and I'm done. Point being that when we're talking anticipatory governance, it's really total, but looking at the question beyond the question, looking at things that we don't see, our mental mindsets, encouraging things that people are not really used to do, encouraging people participation. And I think, to go with what Sherman just mentioned, it's like some kind of collision. So, but if you look at it, but our whole vision would be towards the implementation, if you may, of SDGs, which is 2030. Jerome said, hey, it's in 20, 30 years. 2030, that's 10 years from today. No? the 2040, our own goal. So if we're talking anticipatory governance, knowing where we want to be, and we want to be, when we talk about the SDGs, and of course, the effective governance, they talk about the importance of effectiveness, very, very public administration, very public sector, accountability, and inclusiveness. Inclusiveness, which I think you mentioned also in your initial note, Jerome and Sherman. Okay, inclusiveness, which unfortunately is not really much of. Okay, so this model from the United Nations, I think her name is Adriana Alberti, she became a colleague through the years, has somehow also reaffirmed our own framework. You know, if you want to change public sector, values, rules, goals, resources. So some of these are structural and some of these are, and they also talk about the importance, my other colleague in Thailand, her name is Ora, talk about new capacities. And equally important, critical thinking, equal important, complexity, equal important, futures thinking. So to a certain extent, most of these are within the context of changing our mindsets. Question, if we're talking public sector reform, how do we change the mental models? How do we change the paradigms of our bureaucrats? Because we in the bureaucracy, myself included, we're used to that. I've worked there for full-time for more than 10 years. One really admires the commitment, dedication of so many people in the bureaucracy. But sometimes we are there because it is the bureaucracy, stability, continuity. How do we develop these futures perspective? I'll shut up in a while, Lily. Okay. So people talk about sometimes government workers are harder to motivate, but this is really, and this is from my friend Adriano, who talk about what we don't see, and what we don't see is what is under the okay. So finally, leadership is important. This Diogenes, as you know, went around looking for people who were honest, and of course we have to be practical. Aristotle is pointing up, and Plato is pointing out the otherwise. Okay, I'll end by pointing out and agreeing with what Ms. Noresco earlier about the importance of equity. For whom is anticipatory governance? It is for the next generation. It is for the next generation. It is for children. I have 3 grandchildren. I sometimes wonder what kind of governance is for them. But finally, we have to focus on the vision. The vision, and that was mentioned also earlier, the vision 2030, and Jerome, you told us to look 10 years, 20 years ahead. Let's look at 2030. In the Philippines, we have our own ambition natin, 2040. Keep our eyes on the vision within the context of how does one bring about changes in mental models for our people in the bureaucracy. Is it going against the tide? Yes and no. It's going to be difficult, but hey, public sector reform for anticipatory governance is a challenge that we are gathered here today. Thank you very much, Dr. Lily.
Thank
My
you very
apologies
much.
for having gone over time, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex. We had the very challenging messages from our panelists here, telling us what anticipatory governance is about. And Professor Sherman said it's about transforming human lives. And Dr. Alex said, for whom is anticipatory governance? And he said, it's for the future generation. And Dr. Jerome is saying, how can we engage in anticipatory governance? And he's talking now about artificial general intelligence, a shift from artificial narrow intelligence in order not to be overtaken by that super intelligence that may be beyond our control. But maybe let's get our conversation down to the ground, because we have comments here in the chat box that say, oh, we are befuddled with very highfalutin and words here and concepts. Okay, so before we ask the question, maybe a little background or little simplification of the concept of anticipatory governance for everybody to be able to grasp it. Maybe the simplest way we can define anticipatory governance would be in terms of the ability to take action today or in the present in order to be able to shape, to adapt, or even engage with uncertain futures. In other words, anticipatory governance is about getting ready for events that are not yet clearly visible today in order to improve our prospects of grappling with such unpredictable events in the future, even when they actually occur. And by doing so, we could possibly forestall any destabilizing effects that such events might bring. Okay. Now, anticipatory governance assumes the ability to make sense of and then act on a variety of data, information, and inputs about what is not yet happening, or something that is difficult to talk about because it's not yet there and it might not happen, while it is still possible to do something about them even if they don't happen. So it assumes the capacity for futures thinking and strategic foresight. And therefore, we now would like to pose these questions to our panel to answer. Considering that the capacity for futures thinking and strategic foresight in the country today is still, well, growing and limited to a few number of experts, how then can the Philippines build its capacity for anticipatory governance? How do we make policymakers, public servants, and influencers embrace anticipatory governance? Where do we begin? Okay, that's one question. And in the process of answering, maybe you'd like to answer the next question. How do we incorporate the diverse citizens' perspectives in anticipatory governance to make it inclusive and participatory, and therefore avoiding what Dr. Alex is referring to here as the possibilities of inequity? No? When the capacity for futures thinking is still very limited, and most of our citizens do not understand what it is, or even many of the issues that we need to focus on. And the next question would be, how do we reconcile the seemingly incompatible long-term thinking of future studies and strategic foresight with the short-term cycle of political and administrative regimes that are judged by the way they address the real and present day issues, or what we refer to as wicked problems? So I toss the questions to you. Where do we begin to make the perspectives of our citizens, to make anticipatory governance inclusive and participatory? And how do we reconcile that long-term futures foresight with the short-term cycle, the real cycle of our leaders and our, well, those who make things happen, when they are going to be judged, after all, by the results of how they address present day issues. Okay, so let's ask our panel to help us with those questions. And I'd like to, well, we'll do it that way. We listen first to Dr. Jerome.
All parents understand that they have to plan for the future with their children. They understand that they're taking their child to the elementary school so they can learn enough to get into high school and so forth. Everybody understands that they have to take a long-term perspective with their children. I would hold that analogy all the time you talk with anybody about the future, because that everybody can understand. That's one. Second, a State of the Future Index of the Philippines would be a good idea. You can have it in two sections. One is you have the main thought leaders of the different sections of the Philippines figure out, if the future is better in 10 years, what does that mean specifically? And how would you measure it? When you put that together, then you can have a more public questionnaire to have the public judge what's the best possible for this variable, what's the worst possible for this variable, so that you have a way to put the data together into an integrated index. Right now, we judge the future by the GDP. Well, if you and I have a fight and we go to the hospital, the GDP went up. The quality of life didn't go up, at least not for me. So we need to figure out, what is it that we should measure for a better Philippines? And I think that Sherman and others in the Philippines know is looking at the idea of creating say the future index. That's one thing because you can involve the public in judging what's best possible, but you still need some experts to put together what are the variables because the general public is not going to be able to do that. So that's one thing. A second thing is to have futures courses in the universities across. The third one is in elementary and high school. We teach the future badly or not at all. But what we do, if you're taking a course on physics, they tell you about Copernicus and they tell you about Galileo. So it's normal when you study something to look at the past of it as well. We would also like to look at the future possibilities of it. So if you're taking a general science class, not only do you learn about Aristotle and Copernicus, but you learn about alternative possible futures of nanotechnology and synthetic biology. So that if you know a subject, you should know something about its past and something about its future possibilities. That's the thing that elementary school, high school, and universities could also do. Third, I assume there is in the prime minister's office some unit to some degree of looking at the future. That can be improved by collaboration with other governments around the world. Singapore has an annual meeting of different foresight government players, and I hope the Philippines participates in that and learns from that. So that's probably enough for me for right now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jerome. Can we listen to the comments here, reaction of Professor Sherman?
Yeah, that was a good provocation, Dr. Lily. You know, it reminds me of Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of philosophical views. And I would like to reframe Ludwig here. You know, the limits of my vision are the limits of my world. Originally, he said it like the limits of my language are the limits of my world. Now, if we use foresight as some sort of, let's just say, as another form of language in communicating with the unknown, so I would say that the limits of my visions are the limits of my world. And in visioning, imagination is critical and crucial. You know, because again, imagination, the purpose of imagination is not actually to predict, but we imagine in order for us to anticipate possibilities and create new and build alternative future worlds, right? Then I would add again into that the limits of my imagination are the limits of my world. And where do we begin? This is where we start now. That is why the Philippine Futures Thinking Society has conceived of using imagination as central to its first founding anniversary. That's why we call this the Fiesta of Imagination. In order for us to have an initial conversation of why anticipation is very critical and crucial as a capability and a capacity in the 21st century. And the currency of anticipation is actually imagination. We've heard Albert Einstein once said that the highest form of intelligence is imagination. But if you try to look back like 30, 40 years ago, we never have actually invested, or embedded, imagination as part of our learning and or curriculums. No, we've invested a lot of time in logic, right, in scientific processes, in problem solving, right? Which is, of course, really driven by data, by systems analysis, and perhaps a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of imagination. But given that human civilization is evolving much faster as compared to 30 years ago, that they now see the value of imagination. In fact, the Minister of the Future in Dubai have said that imagination is the currency of the future. And that is actually apparent too, in the discourse in the report of the Work Technology 2050 report published by the Millennium Project, of course, led by Jerome Glenn, that accentuates, tries to anticipate future economies. In one of the scenarios, it said, the self-actualization economy, right? So try to anticipate the future of governing and governance in a self-actualization future, wherein it emphasizes creativity and the ability of the individual to create content, right? It's not about, processes. Processes will be there, but it might not be as apparent as we have now. We're in all the jobs that we have currently are routine driven jobs, right? That you get the job, learn to use the tools and the processes and process this data to create resources. But then, apparently, as anticipation or futures thinking and foresight becomes mainstream and democratized in different parts of the world, that people, organizations, institutions will see the value of futures thinking and foresight. So, to weave all of these insights is that what exactly is anticipation? Uh, in futures literacy, in the context of UNESCO, the idea of futures literacy is the ability and capability to use the future as an asset, a tool, and a resource that we could use to innovate and change today. So first things first, we must be futures literate.
Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Sherman. Very intriguing, no? Saying that the imagination is the currency of the future, but that we do not invest so much on imagination at the moment and put more emphasis on those things we're so used to in the educational system. Okay. So let's listen to Dr. Alex. What are your reactions to those questions that I posed earlier?
Yeah, those are very important questions, Lily. But taking off from what Sherman mentioned, indeed, in fact, I have that huge poster in my office. It's about imagination is really more important than knowledge, and that is so true. Question: I mean, since we're talking about governance, since we're talking public sector reform, how do we quote unquote develop, if you may, this whole discipline of imagination among our in the bureaucracy, if you may? Okay, you know what? The most important thing to recognize, at least in the bureaucracy, is we have to build on hard-earned gains. Build on what is there. Don't be threatening. I mentioned earlier that, of course, the discipline, the bureaucracy is stability, continuity, but there are, and stability and continue towards what? Towards the vision, if you may. No? And I have here, I was looking at this earlier, we have ambition. If you want the copy, I can, ambition natin 2040. This was a plan prepared by the NEDA sometime back, looking what do we want to be in by 2040, and I think it's very important. Point, I think it's really encouraging looking at us. Where do we want to be by 2040, and more important, how can the bureaucracy help here, and what kind of reforms in public sector can we do? Okay, so for me, build on hard-earned gains. I think it's very important. We should not be threatening, no? Because hey, is that something new? Is that a fad again? And I think Sherman have mentioned this a number of times in our webinars, that when we talk about this, it's really to say that hey, this is really not new, because you've been doing a variation of this for the longest time. Okay, so it's really building on those existing things, not be threatening, and then encourage that. Well, you talk about what was it? Was it you who said that there's, I think it was in Greece, that they have in the office of the prime minister, there's a futures thinking office. Well, to a certain extent, that is so true. High priority. In the Philippines today, of course, we have, we are all familiar with the efforts of Senator Cayetano. Some of us are involved in the Department of Education with Secretary Briones. It's beginning too. But more important, it is not new. More important, we're building on existing structures. It might not be as sophisticated as you look at it, but hey, that's what the bureaucracy is all about. They've been around in the Philippines. We've had the bureaucracy for the past 100 years, and we've been talking about reform towards what? So for me, I would build on hard-earned gains, build on the medium-term development plans that we have. I have built on the various medium-term development plans that we have, and then move towards that direction. But include, if you may, this whole discipline of what you just said, Lily, earlier. Include them in quote unquote courses in the universities, but equally important, the role of the civil service, the role of the Civil Service Commission, the role of us academics. No, we are from the National College of Public Health, but many of us around the room today, I know, are from different schools of governance. That is where we can come in, and I think the FTS headed by Sherman and Lisan are in the right direction, and certainly, we're very happy to be part of this initiative. But equally important, not threatening, equally important, build on hard-earned gains, equally important, imagination and incorporating quote unquote new paradigms uh, for anticipatory governance.
Thank you. And Alex, so you're saying then that everybody has a role in a nation, especially a country like the Philippines, where we have already developed our collective vision of the matatag, maginhawa, and panatag na buhay by 2040. No? And how do we get there? And of course, all the gains that we have made in the past have been totally misdirected by this pandemic that we are facing. So it's like we're back to square one. But thank you for your recommendations. Dr. Glenn is saying, well, we have 3 ways to do it. Where do we start? We can start with generating a state of the future index. Oh, that's great, no?
Sure.
Maybe the Philippine Future Society will take on this challenge of developing a state of the future index. Where would the Philippines, would the Philippines be 10 years from now? And if that is what we are saying, what does it mean? Okay, so we already have a ambition natin 2040 that tells us what is our dream to a country and as individuals. You are all also saying that it has something to do with making imagination and futures thinking part really of our process of socialization and growing up. So I like the analogy of Dr. Glenn here when he talks about the parent really has a very long view of what the child is going to be somewhere in the future, very long range. And therefore, everybody has a capacity indeed for anticipatory thinking. And how do we build this? How do we not lose it? How do we make imagination and imagining become more second nature? And part of it is when you say, well, let's embed it in our curriculum, even in the elementary, as we look at the past, we should already introduce a way of looking into the future. So that would be futures courses in the university. And the graduate school of Public and Development Management of the DAP already has such courses. And we have many in the audience right now who are from different universities who could take on this challenge too. And Dr. Jerome has also been saying that might be important to have that structure, that important office very close to the seat of power, which can connect with other like-minded groups and organizations around the world. So that Futures Thinking Office, I'm not sure if that really exists at the moment. Sherman, are you aware if that office exists in the office of the president or in somewhere? I know that there is a committee in the Senate. I'm not sure if we have that Futures Thinking Office. Do we have such office right now?
None yet, except for the Committee on SDGs, Innovation and Futures Thinking.
In the Senate.
Yes, in the Senate. Yep.
Headed by Senator Cayetano.
But no Futures Office, yes. But of course, Noel is here. We're getting there. But no office has been established yet.
Okay, so the recommendations from the floor are saying, let's do it multi-pronged. Let's start it with what the professionals can do, and that is the State of the Future Index. You can attend to that. What the academics can do, which could be to incorporate this ability, which is inherent and innate to all of us, this anticipation and reimagining, to build on what we already have, as according to Dr. Alex, and not be limited, our world to not be limited only by what we know, but to go beyond, to imagine. I like that, no? To make imagination part of our daily life. And Now, how do you blend that then with the short-termism that is inherent in public servants? Because, well, of course, if we connect this to the comment earlier of Dr. Glenn about tying up performance evaluation
Right.
with the capacity for futures thinking, that could be one. But you know, our public next year we're going to have an election, and to get an affirmation through an election means you're addressing the problems of the present. Now, how do we introduce the concept about futures, which are so distant and unreal to us now, when your public servants who can make the difference today are really focused on the short term? So the long term and the short term, how do we bridge that?
I think really you have to disaggregate short-termism between our political leaders and those in the bureaucracy. Because those in the bureaucracy said symbol of continuity, stability. But among our elected leaders, you and I know that they're elected, their terms of office. That I think is an infirmity that we indeed have to correct. After having said that, I think the seeds are there. You have gems and jewels. I've seen this gems and jewels in the bureaucracy who are really concerned about stability, continuity, but question towards what? Towards what? That's precisely why. And I think we should not leave NEDA out of the picture, because to its credit, NEDA has really been looking at that. So para sa akin, for me, it's not like we didn't have it. The seeds are there, variations of it. They may not have been called futures thinking, but in one sense, let's build on that. For me, that's a very, very important principle that we should work on, because the moment that you think that, hey, this is something new, it's threatening, forget you. We'll just wait for the next generation. We'll just wait for the next term. I was a commissioner once in government, and sometimes, you guys just come and go, but we remain. So build on that kind of thinking. We remain because, hey, come on, our ambition natin 2040, how all of us around the room, this is about 20 years from today. How old will you be 20 years from today? Come on, think about that. We won't be around, or many of us will be much older. But that's exactly what we're thinking. And I always tell our people in the bureaucracy, it's not for us, it's for our children. It's for our children. That's why I agree with the presentation that I listened to Miss, I think, Maria Moresco, who talk about equality, but equally important, equity. It's the future, not our future. It is our children, the next generation. And that for me is what equity is all about. Intergenerational equity. And I'll end with this. But we have a bright futures thinking person. His name is Tony Oposa. He already thought about that. What was that? Maybe, some decades back. Lisa knows about it. When he actually brought the government to court in behalf of the next generation. What are you talking about? He said, no, I'm thinking of the next generation. So we came out with our own, Lisa knows this much more than I, the principle of intergenerational equity. So build on what is there. It is there. I think we can be positive.
Okay.
Well, on that idea of building on what is there, I would suspect that Lizanne and Sherman and others in their friends can identify the leading future-oriented people across the whole government. So if you have to explain to somebody, skip it. The persons who immediately get it, you can create a listserv and you can begin to create a community. And so that when the president says, I want some future thinking about X, within a short period of time, like a day or two, you can assess what do the future-oriented people of the Philippines think about this. Now that's different than engaging the public, but sometimes the political leaders need, give me a short overview on this. Give me a short overview on who's going to give it to them. But I am sure there are at least 100 people in the Ministry of Education, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, et cetera, who are future-oriented already, may even be feeling isolated, and you can bring them together into some sort of group. In the United States, there's a thing called the Federal Foresight Community of Interest. And this is, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 people that get together once a month and share what they're doing about the future of the United States government.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glenn. We have good news for you. In the chat box, Dr. Ogadan is saying that the PhilFutures and Millennium Project are now drafting the indicators for the Philippine State of the Futures Index.
Good.
In fact, they're asking for volunteers to work with them to finalize our own Philippine SOFI. So congratulations, Reggie. You're there. We're talking about it and you're a step ahead. You're indeed a real futurist, okay? And there is also a suggestion that we should look into China's comprehensive national power index, crafting our state of the future index. Thank you for that recommendation. Um, uh, there is a question here from Ismael Alango. Anticipating public sector governance, how would you help us understand its implication when Israel is affecting the future of humanity in general? So, in fact, I think the question is about when you talk about general intelligence connecting everybody, not just 95%, but 100%, so that we're all in the same platform. What's happening in one point and affects all of us. So, how do we understand this? So, I pose this question to the futurists. How do I understand information like this?
Yeah. I would like to, of course,
So,
begin.
maybe too far fetched. Yeah, Prof. Sherman.
Yep.
Prof.
Uh,
Sherman.
yes. A futures thinking anticipation is a systems. There is what we call anticipatory systems and processes. To enable you to actually use the future as a resource. There is a process wherein you can link, the vision to Monday morning strategies, right? Like for example, let's just say one of the scenarios that emerged in the Ambition 2040, the preferred or desired future was to create a high trust society. That is one of the elements that was accentuated in Ambition 2040. Now the question is how might you be able to create a high trust governance society, or let's just say political society or economic society, by the year 2040? How might you link that vision to your Monday morning questions? There are tools and methods that you can use in foresight, to enable you to actually, create, the house, the innovations, to help you, to enable you to actually get there, right? So like for example, one tools and methods, quite favorite for all those institutions and organizations like the OECD, the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank, the Singapore ministers, prime minister's office, the Malaysia office of the president, like might, is the use of a backcasting methodology. Backcasting is a method wherein it enables you to actually, like, imagine, like it's some sort of a framing question, like if the high trust society future were to occur today, you know
Mm.
what innovations could you do, to achieve, this vision of high trust society? Because new visions like high trust society, does not exist yet. These are futures about transforming governance, like high trust society, right? It doesn't exist yet. It's there. There might have been some gains, but then the narrative that the Ambition 2040, tries to, in terms of defining how might that look like, what's the storyline as far as high trust society is concerned, what are the milestones that we need to achieve in order to get there, is one of the fundamental conversation that you'll have, as far as foresighting or futuring is concerned. Because futures thinking foresight, bottom line, is also strategy development. It's not just about creating scenarios. So what? Diba? So what if you have a high trust society scenario by the year 2040? That's the embarkation point. That's not the end of futuring and foresight, developing scenarios. But the as far as governance is concerned, the scenarios must enable you, give you the opportunity and a space to have a conversation about strategies. And new visions requires new metrics. New visions requires new indicators. New visions require innovation strategies. New visions require moonshots, right? Like for example, the SDG 2030. Like, what's your moonshot before the decade is out? Yeah. So scenarios is provocation. That's one. Scenarios gives you an alternative enables you to build alternative future worlds. Now, if a community decides that this is the future that we want, then we have to start conversing on how might we be able to achieve that preferred future. That's why capacity is very
Yeah.
critical and crucial. Because if you do foresight in futures without without having the necessary basic foundational capacity and capability, you might just end up envisioning default or use futures.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sherman. So we are now saying that everybody has a stake in the future, even those who are unborn, and it is up to us who are here today to make sure that that generation doesn't lose out because of missed opportunities at our end. And now you are also saying that everybody must play a role. The Civil Service Commission instituting that kind of mindset among public servants. Maybe we can do it through the performance evaluation that was recommended by Dr. Jerome. The education sector, making sure that the capacity for anticipation and futures thinking is nurtured, developed, enhanced, and sustained throughout one's whole life so that when they get into whether it is public service or otherwise, people are capacitated for imagination and futures thinking. And more than just imagining, you are saying that we have to convert this into real strategies that
Sure.
work, breaking this down into uh, indicators that we can work on. So it's not only about dreaming, not about scenario building, but innovation, strategy building, and policy making, which involves all sectors. So now, because our public service, we have, as Dr. Alex said, we have to separate those who are just here for a brief time, the non-career officials from the career. We have to have a program to make sure that our career um, personnel in government develop, nurture, and be given the opportunity to utilize their future's perspective. Um, so we are at the end point of our webinar. It's just 1.5 hours. So I'd like to invite you now to our panel to give your closing statements. So let's start with Dr. Glenn.
The relationship between futures thinking and futures research and strategy is the same like relationship between food and the muscle. The futures thinking nourishes the muscle. Well, what you're doing is a strategy. So if you don't have good food for your muscle, your strategy is very weak. If you have good nutritious food, but it's not connected to people doing strategy, then it's wasted food. So think of food and muscle as a relationship between these two.
Oh, that's a very beautiful analogy, Dr. Glenn, no? So capacity for imagination and futures thinking, let's consider them as the important inputs. We have to build such capacity. They are food. They are build up our muscles. Without that foundation, how do we build strategy? Thank you for that statement. How about Professor Sherman?
Yeah, I had a workshop several years ago in Vientiane, Lao, in partnership with UNESCO, where we did a 3 to 5 days futures and literacy workshop, for the national youth leaders, socialist youth leaders of Lao. And an insight, that I would like to share that emerged in that 5 day conversation about the future of Vientiane, now Lao in particular, is that when one national leader, felt that the future is where the heart is. I was struck by that statement by that young national leader, in Lao, where the future is where the heart is. Now, of course, in the process of doing futures and foresight over the years, I realized that the future does not belong to us. The future does not belong to us, but we belong to it. Why is that framing very critical and crucial? Because we are not here to imagine the future, to colonize it. With that is not the objective of futures and foresight. It's not about us today colonizing the future, but rather it is us today, to give voice for those future generation who does not exist yet and who does not have a voice in the conversation that we're having now. And futures and foresight gives us the space and the ecosystem to allow, this distant far voices to be heard in the way we do futures thinking and foresight. And how might we be able to do that? This is not an abstract concept. Futures and foresight is a system. And one tool that's pretty quite easy to use and really effective is the one that was invented by Jerome Glenn, the futures will analysis, right? So it reminds me, futures wills analysis enables you to have a conversation, you know, to assess the implications and the consequences of the decisions that we make today. Like, what's the first order of consequence when this is our choice? What's the second order of consequence of the first order of consequence? And then the third order of consequence, and the fourth or the fifth, if you want to do that. So when you try to anticipate the consequences of the decisions that we make today, is that where the idea of another future is can be embedded in the way we think about governing and governance, which is the idea of the extended present. You know, uh, at one point, of course, I don't want to give this as an example, but this is one pretty good example of how might we be able to illustrate the use of foresight and influence, assess the implications of future generations or its impact. Like, for example, when Spain occupied or invaded the country, of course, that was traumatic. But then imagine, when Spain was doing all of this colonizing thing, I disowned that, right? But of course, we also learned from that experience. One is the concept of cathedral thinking. They build churches not for the sake of creating news headlines. They build churches because they thought that building churches and changing people's worldviews and mindset, can shift, you know, uh, ways of thinking and living in many ways. So cathedral thinking, in a point, if you use that in the context of foresight, is long-term thinking.
Yeah.
They were making decisions, and the agenda was long-term. It was civilizational. So you can also see futures and foresight as a civilizational project. So when we do governing in governance, our policies, like for example, constitution, these are decades driven types of policies, right? Or documents. So yeah, the point here again is that the future does not belong to us, but we belong to it.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Professor Sherwan. Alex, we would like to hear
Thank
your
you.
closing statement.
Well, let me take off from what Sherman mentioned about cathedral thinking. Actually, I do use that analogy, but within the context of asking our people in public service, what are you doing? Are you simply laying hollow blocks on top of each other to workers, or are you building a wall, or are you building a cathedral? So the whole idea of, hey, we're building something that's really big, this whole vision of a nation, and that for me is very, very important. So in relation to this, keep our eye on the ball. What is our collective vision? No? And how do we get because we're talking about public sector reform here. How do we bring our people in the bureaucracy to really keep their eyes on the ball? Number two, build on hard-earned gains. I think we have to build on that. Let's not be very, very messianic that we're here to save you. We will build on what is already there. And there are things that are already there. And number three, I think it's the importance of you mentioned this, Lily, nurturing, developing, and sustaining within the context of capacity building. Equally important, without being presumptuous. That's why we talk about the importance of public sector reform here. Equally important, really, it is multi-pronged. One, changes structures. Hey, we've been changing structures for the longest time, ever since even many of us were not born. We've always been talking about reorganization towards what? It might not have worked. It might have worked, but hey, don't set it aside. But equally important, something perhaps that we should talk about, and that has been, I think, a subject that we've talked about today, is really the importance of changing our mindsets. That's exactly what Sherman just talked about, the need to change mindsets, and you talk retool our thinking. But equally important, and this is important, I mean, something that we cannot predict, I guess, the importance of leadership. And finally, let's get involved. Citizens participation. And when we talk about that, it's not just us, it's not all about the bureaucracy, it's this whole governance dimension. People, our citizens, and the different sectors get involved. And you're so right about, hey, let's begin with our children. Somebody put in the chat box earlier, I think it's Marcelo put, let's begin with our children. I really think so. How do we bring in the discipline? But equally important, I don't think it is hopeless at this point in time. Let's build on that, because the future, where we are today, is the future 30, 40 years ago. We are the future of the past, see? And are we happy with it? Many of us are not so happy. Come on. And we don't like our children. I don't want my grandchildren to be telling me, hey, this is the future you created for us. We owe it to them. Equity, intergenerational equity. And that's what it's all about. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you, Alex. Going to have 3 grandchildren. Okay, yeah. So you have to think about them in the future. I think we had a very fruitful morning today. We enjoyed the fiesta. I hope everybody will agree with me that this is indeed a celebration of ideas, thinking about prospects of the future today. And we picked up a number of things here. We're happy to hear about the future does not belong to us, but we belong to it, you know. And imagining is the currency, and a very important currency. And in the chat box, we have a number of people who are saying we need this kind of thinking. We are happy to be joined initiatives. Tell us where we can participate. And so we'd like to announce that, yes, you're welcome. Get involved. Join the courses being offered at the JSPDM, that Center for Engaged Foresight. They have ongoing courses on futures thinking, and join the society, the Philippine Futures Thinking organization, and let's all make this happen so that we have a community of participation, molding the future that we want by developing the strategies today using an inherent characteristic in all of us, that capacity to dream, to imagine, to anticipate. And so today I give back the floor to Celine to officially close this webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lily. I definitely agree. It was such a substantive conversation right there while our panelists were discussing. Our chat box was also very active. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for participating. Well, just a short statement echoing our provocateur and our 3 panelists with technological advancements and other political, social, economic, and environmental factors at the center of public service delivery and governance as a whole, there is an existing challenge, and there is indeed a need to anticipate and adapt to be futures ready. As highlighted earlier, this is something achievable if we start today and think long term, and to look at the question, for whom is this? It's for the future generation. So thank you once again, Dr. Lily Domingo. As always, Dr. Lily, amazing facilitation and provocation, as well as how you pose those challenging questions. To our panelists, Dr. Jerome Glenn, Dr. Alex Brillantes, and Prof. Sherman Cruz, such a great trio. You really complemented each other and added much value to the objective of today's webinar. I would now like to proceed with the awarding of the Certificate of Appreciation from the Philippine Futures Thinking Society. So on behalf of the Phil Futures, I would like to read the content of the certificate. This certificate of appreciation is awarded to Dr. Jerome Glenn for sharing his time and expertise as a panel speaker for anticipatory governance towards a futures ready Philippine Public Service, given this 5th day of June 2021 at 10 a.m. Philippine Standard Time via Zoom Video Communications Incorporated, signed by our President, Dr. Lizan E. Perante Calina, and Vice President, Professor Sherman Cruz. Thank you very much, Dr. Jerome. Thank you for
Here.
gracing this webinar. And the
Yep.
same certificate is awarded to Dr. Alex Brillantes Jr. Thank you very much, Dr. Alex, for joining us.
Salamat,
And
salamat.
salamat, sir. And finally, to Dr. Maria Oliva Domingo, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. And of course, we would like to have you on our future webinars, especially on our June 19 main event. Maraming salamat to our panel speakers, Hiraya Manawari po. So I think we reached the end part of today's special webinar. The celebration will still continue for the next days. I will now be flashing our event lineup. Right there, we have a lot of events coming up. So I hope you will tune in to our Facebook page to get updated with all the events that we have organized for you, for all the aspiring futurists, and for those who just really wants to be accustomed with the futures thinking mindset that we have here at the Philippine Futures Thinking Society. So once again, I thank everyone for joining us. And of course, we would not want to miss an photo opportunity with all our attendees today. So let's now head on to our gallery photo session. All right, so on my count, I hope everyone can open their cameras. All right. Okay, on my count po. 1, 2, 3, smile. Page 2. And the last one. All right. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Hiraya Manawari.
Thank you,
Thank you
thank
po,
you.
Hiray Manawari.
Thank you.
Kaya
Thank you,
Manawari.
everyone. Thank
Thank you.
you.